Before we begin, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about getting high. This is a story about how your grandmother's medicine cabinet, your family doctor's prescription pad, and the most trusted pharmaceutical companies in America accidentally created the greatest cultural revolution of the 20th century. The pills that built the hippie generation weren't sold in back alleys. They were handed out at corner pharmacies. So if you're here for the journey, like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to go deep. Phone away, distractions silenced. Let's begin. In the beginning, there was the medicine cabinet. Picture it now, a suburban American bathroom in 1955. The house is new, the lawn is trimmed, the Chevrolet sits gleaming in the driveway, and behind that mirrored door above the sink lies a collection of chemicals that would make a 1970s commune blush. Seconal for sleeping, little red capsules that promised 8 hours of oblivion. Nembutal for the nerves, yellow jackets they called them on the street. But here they came in a pharmacy bottle with a typed label and a doctor's signature. Benzedrine for energy, for weight loss, for getting through the day when the getting was hard. Milltown for anxiety, those little white tablets that Hollywood stars swallowed like candy and talked about openly at cocktail parties. This is not metaphor. This is inventory. The average middle-class American household in 1955 contained more mind-altering substances than most people today would believe possible, and every single one of them was legal, prescribed, respectable, and endorsed by the family physician. We have been taught to think of the 1960s drug explosion as something that happened to America, an invasion from the margins, a corruption of innocent youth by sinister outsiders. But the truth is far stranger and far more disturbing. The drugs did not come from the counterculture. The counterculture came from the drugs, and those drugs came from the most respectable institutions in American life. The pharmaceutical industry, the medical establishment, the very pillars of post-war prosperity. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the end of World War II, to a moment of unprecedented optimism and an industry that was about to transform itself and the nation along with it. The war had proven something remarkable about modern medicine. Antibiotics worked, penicillin had saved countless lives on the battlefield, sulfur drugs had turned infections that would have been death sentences into minor inconveniences. For the first time in human history, doctors could actually cure things. They were no longer merely managing symptoms or offering comfort. They had weapons, chemical weapons, against disease itself, and the pharmaceutical companies that had ramped up production for the war effort now faced a choice. They could scale back to pre-war levels, or they could find new enemies to fight, new conditions to cure, new markets to conquer. They chose conquest. The logic seemed sound, even inevitable. If chemistry could cure infections of the body, surely chemistry could cure afflictions of the mind. If penicillin could kill bacteria, surely something could kill unhappiness. The human brain, after all, was just another organ. It ran on electricity and chemicals like everything else. Find the right molecule, adjust the right balance, and you could fix whatever was broken. This was the promise, and the American public, flush with victory and optimism, was eager to believe it. The breakthrough came in 1955 with a drug called meprobamate, marketed under the brand name Milltown. Its inventor was a Czech émigré named Frank Berger, a scientist who had stumbled upon the compound while searching for a better muscle relaxant. What he found instead was something that seemed to melt anxiety away, that calmed the jangled nerves of modern life without putting people to sleep. Carter Products, the company that licensed the drug, recognized immediately that they had something special. They marketed it not as medicine for the mentally ill, but as relief for the ordinary stresses of contemporary existence. And America devoured it. Within a year of its release, Milltown was the fastest-selling drug in American history. Pharmacies could not keep it in stock. Doctors were writing prescriptions by the millions. At Hollywood parties, guests would ask each other if they had taken their Milltown yet. The word entered the vernacular as a synonym for calmness, for equanimity, for the chemical serenity that modern life seemed to require. Milton Berle, the comedian, joked that he should rename himself Milltown Berle. The drug was so popular that knockoffs flooded the market, and by 1957 a full third of all prescriptions written in the United States were for some kind of psychoactive medication. One third. Let that sink in. Before the Summer of Love, before Woodstock, before Timothy Leary, and Ken Kesey and everything we associate with the drug culture of the 1960s, 1 out of every 3 prescriptions in America was for a pill that changed how the mind worked. And who was taking these pills? Everyone, but especially women. The tranquilizers of the 1950s were marketed overwhelmingly to housewives, to mothers, to the women trapped in suburban homes with no careers and no outlets, and nothing to do but cook and clean and wait for their husbands to come home. The pharmaceutical advertisements of the era are shocking to modern eyes. They show frazzled women surrounded by screaming children with captions asking if modern life is too much for her. They depict anxious wives unable to satisfy their husbands with suggestions that a simple pill could restore domestic harmony. By 1959, American doctors were prescribing tranquilizers to women at twice the rate they prescribed them to men. The medical establishment had decided that female discontent was a disease, and they had the cure. The housewife's malaise, the restlessness that Betty Friedan would later call the problem that has no name, was being treated not with liberation but with sedation. And the women took the pills because the doctors told them to, because their husbands encouraged it, because the alternative was to admit that something was fundamentally wrong with the bargain they had been sold. But it was not just tranquilizers. Amphetamines were everywhere too, prescribed for weight loss, for depression, for fatigue, for the simple challenge of keeping up with the demands of modern motherhood. The same woman who took a Milltown to calm down might take a Dexedrine to perk up, might wash down her diet pills with her morning coffee and wonder why she felt so strange by afternoon. The children watched. They could not help but watch. They saw their mothers reach for the medicine cabinet when the day grew hard. They saw their fathers take pills to sleep after a stressful week at the office. They absorbed, as children do, the lesson that was being taught without words. When you feel bad, there is a chemical solution. When life is difficult, there is a pill that can help. This was not the counterculture speaking. This was mainstream America, respectable America, the America of church on Sunday and flag on the porch. And it was training an entire generation to believe that consciousness was something to be adjusted, managed, optimized through chemistry. The doctors who prescribed these drugs were not villains. Most of them genuinely believed they were helping their patients, but they were also being helped themselves. The pharmaceutical industry had discovered that doctors were the gateway to the American wallet, and they set about cultivating that gateway with extraordinary sophistication. Sales representatives fanned out across the country. Handsome young men in sharp suits carrying sample cases filled with the latest medications. They brought gifts, pens and notepads and desk calendars, all emblazoned with drug names. They invited doctors to conferences in Miami and Honolulu, all expenses paid, where the scientific presentations somehow always concluded that the sponsoring company's products were superior. They provided free samples, enough to get patients started, enough to create habits that would require prescriptions to maintain. And the doctors, overwhelmed by the pace of pharmaceutical innovation, with no time to read every study and evaluate every claim, increasingly relied on what the sales representatives told them. The long-term effects of these drugs were unknown because no one had studied them. Barbiturate addiction was already becoming epidemic by the late 1950s, but it was not called addiction. It was called dependence, a softer word that implied the patient needed the drug rather than that the drug had enslaved the patient. Withdrawal from barbiturates could cause seizures and hallucinations and cardiac arrest, but this was not widely discussed. The pills kept selling, the prescriptions kept flowing, and the medicine cabinets kept filling. By the time the 1960s dawned, America had already undergone its first drug revolution. It had just been too respectable to notice. The generation that would become the hippies, the flower children, The counterculture that would shock and terrify their parents had grown up in this world. They had watched their mothers sedate themselves into docility. They had seen their fathers pop pills to keep pace with the demands of corporate life. They had learned, before they ever encountered marijuana or LSD, that consciousness was negotiable, that the mind was something to be chemically managed, that there was always a substance that could make you feel different than you felt. When they discovered their own drugs, the drugs of rebellion, rather than conformity, they were not learning a new behavior. They were applying an old lesson in a new context. The pharmaceutical companies had already broken the seal. They had already normalized the idea that you could and should alter your mental state through chemistry. All the hippies did was choose different chemicals for different purposes. The baby boomers did not invent drug culture. They inherited it. Their parents passed it down from those mirrored medicine cabinets, from those visits to the family doctor, from those advertisements promising better living through chemistry. The question by 1960 was never whether Americans would alter their consciousness. That question had been answered definitively in the affirmative. The question was whose consciousness would be altered by whose drugs for whose purposes. The pharmaceutical industry wanted to sell tranquility and productivity, calm workers and compliant wives. The counterculture would want something else entirely, but the principle was the same. The door had been opened. It could not be closed again. But the medicine cabinet was just the beginning. In the shadows of the Cold War, something far stranger was being brewed. Not by hippies, not by dealers, not by anyone the public would have recognized as a threat. It was being brewed by men in grey suits who reported to work at government buildings and carried briefcases and looked exactly like the respectable fathers who filled those suburban medicine cabinets. They worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and they were about to accidentally create the psychedelic revolution. The men who would accidentally create the psychedelic revolution did not wear flowers in their hair. They wore grey flannel suits and horn-rimmed glasses. They carried briefcases to work in buildings with no names. They believed, with the fervour of true patriots, that they were protecting America from an enemy that would stop at nothing to destroy it. And in their paranoid quest for the ultimate weapon of the mind, they would unleash something they could never control. It began with a confession. In February 1949, Joseph Cardinal Mindszenty, the Catholic primate of Hungary, appeared before a communist show trial in Budapest. The cardinal had been one of the fiercest critics of the new Soviet-backed regime, a symbol of religious resistance to godless communism. But something was terribly wrong. Mindszenty stood before the court with glassy eyes and a slack expression. He spoke in a monotone, confessing to crimes against the state, admitting to treason and conspiracy, renouncing everything he had stood for. To the watching world, and especially to the intelligence professionals in Washington, the message was clear. The communists had done something to him. They had broken him somehow, not through torture alone, but through some dark science of the mind. The Americans became convinced that the Soviets had developed techniques for mind control, drugs or hypnosis, or some combination that could turn any man into a puppet. This was terrifying. If the enemy could reach into a man's skull and reprogram his loyalties, no secret was safe, no agent could be trusted, no defense could hold. The Cold War was not just a contest of missiles and armies. It was a battle for the human mind itself, and America was losing. At least, that is what the Central Intelligence Agency believed. In April 1950, CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter approved a project called Bluebird, dedicated to investigating interrogation methods and the possibilities of mind control. The goal was defensive at first. They wanted to understand what the Soviets might be doing so they could protect their own agents. But defense quickly became offense. If the enemy had these techniques, America needed them too. Bluebird evolved into Artichoke, and Artichoke would eventually become the notorious MK Ultra, under the direction of a man whose name would become synonymous with government-sponsored horror. Alan Dulles took over as CIA director in 1953, and he was obsessed with the idea of a magic pill, a chemical that could make any enemy spill his secrets, that could turn any captured agent into a compliant informant. Dulles had seen too much during World War II, had run too many operations where information meant the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death for thousands. He wanted certainty. He wanted control, and he gave virtually unlimited authority to a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb to find it. Gottlieb was an unlikely figure for the role of America's secret drug lord. He had a clubfoot and a stutter. He raised goats on a farm in Virginia and practiced folk dancing. But behind those eccentric habits was a brilliant and utterly ruthless mind. Gottlieb would become known within the agency as the Black Sorcerer, and he would earn that name through experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Under his direction, MK Ultra would eventually encompass at least 149 sub-projects spread across 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The agency spent millions of dollars searching for the key to the human mind. They experimented with everything. Mescaline, the active compound in peyote which produced visions but no compliance. Barbiturates, which put subjects to sleep before they could be properly interrogated. Cocaine, which made them talkative but unreliable. Heroin, which made them pliable but useless. Scopolamine, which induced a twilight state but erased memories of what was said. Electroshock. Sensory deprivation. Hypnosis. Nothing worked the way they wanted. Nothing gave them the clean, reliable control they sought. And then they found LSD. The drug had been discovered a decade earlier in the laboratories of Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Basel, Switzerland. A chemist named Albert Hofmann had been searching for a circulatory stimulant when he synthesized lysergic acid diethylamide on November 16, 1938. He set the compound aside, finding nothing remarkable about it. But 5 years later, on April 16, 1943, he was resynthesizing the substance when a small amount somehow entered his system, probably through his fingertips. What followed was the first LSD trip in human history. Hoffman felt dizzy and restless. He went home early, lay down, and experienced what he later described as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colours. The effect lasted 2 hours and then faded, leaving Hoffman profoundly curious. 3 days later, on April 19, 1943, the date that would become known to psychedelic enthusiasts as Bicycle Day, Hoffman deliberately ingested 250 micrograms of LSD, a dose he assumed would be threshold, but which turned out to be powerfully active. The experience overwhelmed him. He asked his laboratory assistant to escort him home by bicycle, wartime restrictions having made automobiles unavailable, and during that ride, the world transformed. Hoffman's face became a demonic mask in the mirror. His neighbour seemed to be a malevolent witch. Everything familiar became alien and threatening, and then, gradually, the terror gave way to wonder. Colours became sounds. Thoughts took visible form. The boundaries of self dissolved into something larger, something cosmic. Hoffman had stumbled upon one of the most potent psychoactive substances ever discovered, active in doses measured in millionths of a gram, capable of producing experiences that mystics had sought through decades of meditation. Sandoz had no idea what to do with it. They marketed it tentatively under the brand name Delicid, suggesting it might be useful for psychiatric research, for helping therapists understand the experience of psychosis, perhaps for loosening the defenses of resistant patients in psychotherapy. But sales were slow. The drug remained obscure, a curiosity known only to a small circle of researchers. Until the CIA discovered it. The agency first learned of LSD in 1950, and Gottlieb immediately recognized its potential. Here was a substance that could completely disrupt normal consciousness, that could dissolve the ego, that could make the familiar strange and the impossible seem real. Surely such a compound could be used to break down resistance to interrogation. Surely it could disorient enemy agents, confuse their loyalties, make them reveal what they would otherwise die to protect. The CIA moved quickly. Through front organizations, they purchased the entire world's supply of LSD, buying up everything Sandoz could produce and contracting with Eli Lilly to develop domestic production methods that would free them from dependence on a foreign source. By the early 1950s, the United States government was the largest consumer of LSD on the planet, and virtually no one outside the intelligence community knew it existed. The experiments began in earnest. At first, they used agency volunteers, men who signed up knowing they would be given an unknown substance and observed for its effects. But the results were inconsistent, and the volunteers knew too much. Gottlieb decided he needed unwitting subjects, people who had no idea they were being drugged, whose reactions would be uncontaminated by expectation. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in American government history. Operation Midnight Climax established safe houses in New York and San Francisco that were designed to look like brothels. The CIA hired prostitutes to lure men back to these apartments, where their drinks would be surreptitiously dosed with LSD. Agency operatives would watch through two-way mirrors as the unsuspecting victims experienced the full force of an unexpected psychedelic trip, taking notes on their behavior, their confusion, their terror. The men had no idea what was happening to them. Some thought they were going insane. None ever learned the truth. At the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which served as a prison for drug addicts, a researcher named Harris Isbell conducted experiments on inmates who were offered reduced sentences or supplies of their drug of choice in exchange for participation. He gave them massive doses of LSD for weeks on end, studying tolerance and withdrawal, treating human beings as laboratory animals. At least one subject was kept continuously intoxicated on LSD for 77 days straight. The universities were involved too, though most researchers did not know who was really funding their work. Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, MIT, dozens of institutions received grants channeled through front organizations with innocent-sounding names. Scientists who thought they were doing basic research were unknowingly serving the CIA's agenda. The scope of MK Ultra was staggering. Thousands of people were dosed without their knowledge or consent. Many suffered lasting psychological damage. Some never recovered, and at least one man died. Frank Olson was a biochemist who worked for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, developing biological weapons. In November 1953, he attended a retreat at a cabin in rural Maryland with a group of colleagues. What Olson did not know was that Sidney Gottlieb had secretly dosed the after-dinner drinks with LSD. As the drug took effect, the men were told what had been done to them. Most found the experience disturbing, but manageable. Olson did not. Something broke in him that night. In the days that followed, he became increasingly paranoid, convinced that he had made a terrible mistake, that he was going to be made to disappear. His colleagues grew worried enough to bring him to New York for psychiatric evaluation. On November 28, 1953, Frank Olson either jumped or was pushed through the closed window of his 10th floor room at the Statler Hotel. He fell to his death on the sidewalk below. The CIA told his family nothing, concocting a story about a work-related breakdown. It would be more than 2 decades before the truth emerged, and even then the full story remained murky. Olson's son would spend much of his life investigating his father's death, eventually having the body exhumed for forensic examination. The findings were disturbing. There was evidence of a blow to the head before the fall, evidence that did not fit the suicide narrative. Was Frank Olson murdered to keep the secrets of MK Ultra buried? The question has never been definitively answered, but the agency's willingness to experiment on unwitting citizens, to sacrifice lives in pursuit of their goal, is beyond dispute. And yet for all the horror, for all the suffering inflicted, MK Ultra was a failure. LSD did not produce reliable truth-telling. It did not create programmable assassins. It did not give the CIA the magic pill Alan Dulles had dreamed of. Instead, it produced something far stranger and more dangerous to the establishment than anything they had imagined. It produced converts. The irony of MK Ultra is almost too perfect to believe. The program designed to find methods of mind control instead found methods of mind liberation. The drug intended to break enemies instead awakened allies. The weapon meant to serve the establishment instead armed the counterculture. It happened because the experiments could not be perfectly contained. The researchers who administered LSD could not help but become curious about its effects. Many of them tried it themselves and were transformed by the experience. They saw things that their training had not prepared them for, felt connections to something larger than their government jobs and their security clearances. Some of them began to wonder if this substance might have applications beyond interrogation, beyond warfare, beyond anything the CIA had envisioned. Aldous Huxley was among the first intellectuals to grasp the significance of psychedelic experience. The British novelist, author of Brave New World, had been interested in mysticism and altered states for years. In 1953, he took mescaline under the supervision of a psychiatrist and found himself transported into a realm of pure perception, of unfiltered reality, of what he called the mind at large. His account of the experience, published in 1954 as The Doors of Perception, became a foundational text for the psychedelic movement. Huxley wrote of seeing the world washed clean of concepts, of experiencing the divine in the fold of a cloth, of understanding suddenly what the mystics had been trying to describe. The book found readers hungry for exactly this kind of revelation. Young people disillusioned with materialism, artists seeking new forms of inspiration, seekers in search of something they could not name, and many of those readers would eventually find their way to LSD. But the crucial leak, the moment when the drug escaped definitively from government control, came through a young novelist named Ken Kesey. In 1959, Kesey was a graduate student at Stanford, working on a novel and looking for ways to make extra money. He signed up to participate in drug experiments at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park, trials that he was told were studying psychotomimetic substances, drugs that mimicked psychosis. He was paid $20 a session to take these substances and report on their effects. He had no idea that the experiments were funded by the CIA as part of MK Ultra. The drugs included mescaline, psilocybin, IT-290, and LSD-25. Kesey took them all, and LSD in particular changed his life. Instead of experiencing confusion or terror, Kesey found clarity. Instead of ego dissolution producing vulnerability, it produced insight. He saw through the social games that people played. He felt connected to something vast and ancient and true. He was not broken by the experience, he was awakened. Kesey got a job as a night aide at the same VA hospital, working on the psychiatric ward. There he observed how the mental health system treated its patients, drugging them into compliance, stripping them of autonomy, confining them in institutions that claimed to heal but seemed only to control. The experience would inform his first novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a searing indictment of institutional power that would become one of the defining texts of the 1960s. But Kesey was not content merely to write. He wanted to share what he had discovered. He began stealing LSD from the hospital supplies, bringing it home, giving it to friends and fellow artists in the bohemian community around Stanford. These informal sessions evolved into the legendary acid tests, large public gatherings where LSD was freely distributed, and the Grateful Dead provided the soundtrack for collective trips into the unknown. Kesey and his merry band, who called themselves the Merry Pranksters, travelled the country in a painted school bus named Further, driven by the legendary Neil Cassidy, spreading the gospel of psychedelic liberation wherever they went. They were creating a new culture, a new way of being, a movement that would soon explode across the nation, and they were doing it with a drug that the CIA had given them. Meanwhile, on the other coast, another accidental apostle was beginning his own journey. Timothy Leary was a respected clinical psychologist at Harvard, a mainstream academic with a promising career, when he first tried psilocybin mushrooms during a vacation in Mexico in 1960. The experience shattered his professional detachment. He saw the socially constructed nature of reality, the arbitrariness of the roles people played, the possibility of something richer and more authentic. He returned to Harvard determined to study these substances scientifically, and he established the Harvard Psilocybin Project with a younger colleague named Richard Alpert. They gave psilocybin to graduate students, to prisoners, to divinity students, carefully documenting the results. The findings were remarkable. Subjects reported profound mystical experiences, lasting changes in personality, new perspectives on their lives and problems. The prisoners showed unprecedented rates of rehabilitation. The divinity students compared their experiences favorably to genuine religious revelations. But Leary was not content with cautious science. He was a charismatic figure, hungry for attention, convinced that he had discovered something that could transform human consciousness on a global scale. He began conducting experiments with less and less scientific rigor. He took the drugs himself repeatedly, breaking the fundamental barrier between researcher and subject. He invited undergraduates to participate, raising concerns about exploitation. He became increasingly flamboyant in his claims, increasingly dismissive of academic constraints. By 1963, Harvard had had enough. Leary and Alpert were dismissed from the faculty, a scandal that made national news and only increased their fame. Expelled from the academy, Leary embraced his role as prophet of the psychedelic movement. He and his followers established a commune at a mansion in Millbrook, New York, where they continued their explorations and attracted a steady stream of seekers, celebrities, and media attention. Leary coined the phrase that would become the mantra of a generation: turn on, tune in, drop out. It was a declaration of war against the establishment, an invitation to reject conventional values and seek higher consciousness through chemistry, and it spread like wildfire through the youth culture of America. The irony is almost unbearable. The drugs that Leary was promoting, the experiences he was describing, the movement he was building, all of it traced back to government laboratories and CIA funding. The agency had spent millions trying to find ways to control minds, and instead they had created the apostles of mental liberation. They had trained their own enemies, supplied them with the very weapon they feared, and set loose forces that would challenge everything the national security state stood for. By 1966, an estimated 4 million Americans had tried LSD. The drug had escaped completely from any possibility of control. It was being manufactured in underground labs, distributed through informal networks, consumed at concerts and gatherings and parties across the nation. The government finally moved to criminalize it in October 1966, adding LSD to the list of controlled substances, imposing harsh penalties for manufacture, sale, or possession. But it was far too late. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. The drug that the CIA had hoped would break the minds of enemies had instead opened the minds of millions of young Americans. The substance intended to produce compliant subjects had produced passionate rebels. The weapon designed to serve power had been turned against it. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented history confirmed by congressional investigations and declassified documents and the agency's own reluctant admissions. MK Ultra happened. Thousands of unwitting people were drugged by their own government. Frank Olson died under mysterious circumstances. And the counterculture that would define the 1960s was born in CIA laboratories, nurtured with federal funds and unleashed by accident on an unsuspecting nation. The psychedelic revolution was not an invasion from outside American society. It was an escape from within, a creature of the national security state that turned against its creators. The establishment had no one to blame but itself. But acid was just the headline, the spectacular story that grabbed attention and inspired fear. In the shadows of the psychedelic explosion, another drug was quietly spreading across America, older and earthier, less dramatic, but ultimately more widespread. And this one did not come from government laboratories or Swiss pharmaceutical companies. It came from across the border, carried by immigrants and artists and musicians, emerging from an underground that had existed for decades beneath the notice of respectable society. It was marijuana. And its journey from the margins to the mainstream would follow its own strange path, shaped by racism and rebellion, by jazz clubs and college campuses, by forces that had nothing to do with the CIA and everything to do with the changing soul of America. While acid grabbed the headlines and terrified the authorities with its reality-dissolving power, another drug was making a quieter but ultimately more significant journey through American culture. Marijuana had been prohibited since 1937, criminalized through a campaign of racist propaganda and bureaucratic manipulation that we have explored elsewhere. Harry Anslinger and his Federal Bureau of Narcotics had succeeded in demonizing cannabis, associating it with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, transforming a plant that had been legal for thousands of years into a symbol of foreign contamination and moral decay. But prohibition had not eliminated marijuana. It had merely driven it underground, into the communities that the white mainstream preferred not to see, into the spaces where marginalized people gathered beyond the gaze of respectable society. And there, in those hidden corners of America, cannabis culture survived and even thrived throughout the 1940s and 1950s, waiting for the moment when it would emerge into the light. The keepers of the flame were primarily two groups that overlapped in significant ways. Mexican-American communities in the Southwest had never stopped using marijuana. It was part of their cultural heritage, a folk medicine and mild intoxicant that their grandparents had used, that the border could not stop, that no amount of propaganda could make them fear. In the barrios of Los Angeles and El Paso and San Antonio, cannabis remained available to those who knew where to look, passed from hand to hand in a network invisible to Anglo authorities. The other guardians were the jazz musicians, black artists who had discovered that marijuana enhanced their music in ways that alcohol could not match. Louis Armstrong was a lifelong user who called it gauge and credited it with helping him relax and play more creatively. Cab Calloway sang about the Reefer Man in his 1932 hit, a coded celebration that those in the know understood perfectly. Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker, virtually every major figure in jazz had experience with cannabis, and many used it regularly as part of their creative process. The drug slowed down time, heightened sensory awareness, made the spaces between notes feel infinite with possibility. It was the perfect accompaniment to improvisation, to the spontaneous creation that was the soul of jazz. For the jazz community, marijuana was not a dangerous narcotic. It was a tool, a sacrament, a shared bond among fellow travelers in the world of music. But jazz was black music, and black life in 1950s America was largely invisible to the white middle class except as entertainment. The suburban families who listened to jazz on their record players had no idea that the musicians they admired were often high when they recorded those performances. The nightclubs where jazz thrived were in neighborhoods that respectable white people did not visit, or visited only as tourists seeking something exotic. Marijuana existed in America throughout the 1950s, but it existed in a parallel universe that the mainstream knew nothing about. The bridge between these worlds was built by the Beat Generation, a loose collection of writers and artists who rejected the conformity of post-war America and sought authentic experience wherever they could find it. Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Gregory Corso, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, these were white men, educated men, men who could have had conventional careers and comfortable lives. Instead, they chose the margins. They haunted the jazz clubs and the after-hours joints. They befriended musicians and hustlers and drifters. They sought out the underground because they sensed that something true was happening there, something that the bland surface of Eisenhower's America had tried to bury. And in the underground, they discovered marijuana. For the Beats, cannabis was a revelation. It opened doors of perception, slowed the rushing mind, allowed them to see the world with fresh eyes. It was also a statement, a rejection of everything their parents' generation valued. To smoke marijuana was to step outside the law, to align oneself with the outcasts and the rebels, to declare that the rules of square society did not apply. Ginsberg wrote his epic poem Howl in 1955, a howling indictment of American materialism and conformity that begins with the famous line about the best minds of his generation destroyed by madness. That poem was fueled by marijuana and other substances, by the visions that came when the doors of perception were cleansed. When Howl was published in 1956 and immediately subjected to an obscenity trial, it became a cause célèbre, a rallying point for everyone who felt suffocated by the bland optimism of the 1950s. Kerouac's On the Road, published in 1957, told the story of restless young men crisscrossing America in search of kicks and meaning, and marijuana was part of that search. The book became a Bible for a generation of young people who felt trapped in the suburbs, who sensed that there must be something more than the life their parents had mapped out for them. The Beats gathered in coffee houses in Greenwich Village and San Francisco's North Beach, reading their poetry to receptive audiences, smoking marijuana in back rooms and apartments, creating a bohemian culture that would become the template for what followed. They made pot literary, intellectual, rebellious. They stripped away the association with Mexican laborers and black musicians, not because they rejected those communities, but because they embraced them, because they saw themselves as fellow outsiders. And in doing so, they made marijuana accessible to young white Americans in a way it had never been before. The coffee houses became transmission points. A college student from the Midwest might wander into City Lights bookstore in San Francisco, buy a copy of Howl, strike up a conversation with a bearded stranger, and find himself invited to a party where joints were passed around as casually as drinks. He would go back to his campus with new ideas and new habits, and he would share them with his friends. This is how cultures spread. Through personal connections, through trusted networks, through the human need to share discoveries with others. By the early 1960s, marijuana had established a beachhead in white Bohemia, but it remained a minority taste, associated with artists and intellectuals and the fringes of society. That changed with the emergence of the hippie movement. The counterculture that exploded in the mid-1960s drew on beat influences but transformed them into something larger and more accessible. Where the Beats had been literary and introspective, the hippies were communal and celebratory. Where the Beats had been a small circle of friends, the hippies became a mass movement, and marijuana became their everyday sacrament. LSD was powerful but demanding. A trip lasted 8 to 12 hours and required careful attention to set and setting. It could be transcendent or terrifying, and it was not something you did casually or frequently. Marijuana was different. It was gentle and sociable. It enhanced music and food and conversation without completely disrupting normal functioning. It could be shared easily, passed from hand to hand in a ritual of communion, and it was cheap, far cheaper than the pharmaceutical industry's offerings, far more available than LSD as the government cracked down on psychedelic manufacture. In the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which became the geographic heart of the hippie movement, marijuana smoke hung in the air like incense. It was smoked openly in the parks and on the streets, shared freely among strangers who recognized each other as fellow travelers by their long hair and colorful clothing. The Summer of Love in 1967 drew tens of thousands of young people to San Francisco, and almost all of them smoked pot. It was as central to the hippie experience as the music and the clothing and the philosophy of peace and love. The numbers tell the story. In 1965, about 5% of college students had tried marijuana at least once. By 1967, that figure had doubled. By 1969, it had doubled again. The drug was spreading through the youth culture with astonishing speed, passed from friend to friend, campus to campus, city to city. For the first time since Prohibition began, a significant portion of white middle-class America was using marijuana, and the authorities responded with panic. The arrests began in earnest. Young white people, the sons and daughters of respectable families, were being caught with marijuana and hauled into court. This was not supposed to happen. Marijuana was supposed to be a drug for Mexicans and Negroes, for jazz musicians and degenerates. Now it was appearing in suburban bedrooms and college dormitories, and parents were horrified to discover that their children were using the same drug that Harry Anslinger had warned them about decades earlier. The punishment disparity was stark and revealing. When black users were arrested for marijuana, they went to prison. When white users were arrested, there was suddenly talk of rehabilitation, of treatment, of understanding the underlying issues that led young people astray. The same drug, the same behavior, but completely different consequences depending on the color of your skin. Judges who had sent black men away for years found themselves looking at defendants who reminded them of their own children, and they discovered a capacity for leniency they had never shown before. But even this differential justice could not stem the tide. The prisons began filling with young white marijuana users, and their families began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was their son serving 5 years for possessing a plant? Why was a momentary indiscretion destroying a promising future? Why were the pharmaceutical companies allowed to sell far more dangerous drugs legally while marijuana remained forbidden? The hypocrisy became impossible to ignore. The same doctors who prescribed barbiturates and amphetamines with abandon, the same medicine cabinets that overflowed with legal mind-altering substances, the same culture that encouraged chemical solutions to every problem now condemned marijuana as if it were the source of all evil. The contradiction was absurd on its face, and a generation of young people saw through it. What they did not see, or did not want to see, was the political dimension of the crackdown. The marijuana arrests were not primarily about drugs. They were about control. The Nixon administration, like the establishments that preceded it, understood that marijuana was a way to target the counterculture without appearing to target political beliefs directly. You could not arrest someone for opposing the Vietnam War. You could not arrest them for questioning American values, but you could arrest them for possessing marijuana. And since almost everyone in the anti-war movement used marijuana, the effect was the same. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, would later admit this explicitly. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. They knew they could not make it illegal to be against the war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities. They could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did they know they were lying about the drugs? Of course they did. This is not speculation. This is confession, the admission of a strategy designed to use drug law as a weapon against political dissent. The marijuana crackdown of the late 1960s was not about public health. It was about silencing opposition. The plant itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was who used it and what they believed. The pattern from the 1930s was repeating itself with eerie precision. Just as Anslinger had used marijuana to target Mexican immigrants and black musicians, Nixon was using it to target hippies and anti-war activists. The drug was always a pretext, a convenient excuse for the suppression of people the establishment found threatening. The actual pharmacology, the actual effects, the actual dangers, or lack thereof, none of that mattered. What mattered was control. And so marijuana became the great symbol of the culture war, the dividing line between straight America and the counterculture, between those who obeyed the rules and those who questioned them. Parents who swallowed tranquilizers every night condemned their children for smoking pot. Executives who drank 3 martinis at lunch called marijuana users degenerates. The hypocrisy was total and unacknowledged, invisible to those who practiced it, glaringly obvious to those who suffered from it. But here is the deepest irony of all. While America panicked about marijuana, while police departments dedicated resources to busting college students for possessing a plant, while the prisons filled and the culture war raged, something far more dangerous was hiding in plain sight. It was not on the streets or in the communes or anywhere the authorities thought to look. It was in the very pharmacies and doctors' offices that respectable America trusted implicitly. The same pharmaceutical industry that had normalized pill popping in the 1950s had continued to innovate, continued to produce new substances for new markets, continued to profit from America's insatiable appetite for chemical solutions. And one of those substances was about to tear the counterculture apart from within, while destroying countless lives in the straight world as well. It was speed, methamphetamine, the drug that respectable America used for weight loss and energy, even as it condemned the hippies for their marijuana, and its story reveals the final dimension of the great hypocrisy at the heart of the 1960s drug explosion. The drug that would cause more damage than marijuana and LSD combined was not sold on street corners or distributed at acid tests. It came in neat little bottles from the pharmacy, prescribed by family doctors, advertised in medical journals with smiling models and reassuring copy. It was amphetamine, and by the 1960s it had become so deeply embedded in American life that most people did not even think of it as a drug at all. It was just medicine, just a little help getting through the day, just something the doctor ordered. The history of amphetamine stretches back to 1887, when a Romanian chemist first synthesized the compound, but its modern story begins with World War II. Every major combatant discovered that amphetamines could keep soldiers awake and alert for extended periods, could push human endurance beyond its natural limits, could turn exhausted men into fighting machines for a few more crucial hours. The German Wehrmacht distributed millions of Pervitin tablets to its troops during the Blitzkrieg. The British Royal Air Force gave Benzedrine to its pilots flying long bombing missions. The American military followed suit, handing out pep pills to soldiers and airmen throughout the Pacific and European theatres. By the end of the war, millions of men had been introduced to amphetamines, had learned that chemistry could override the body's need for sleep and rest. When peace came, the pharmaceutical industry faced the same question it had faced with other wartime innovations. What do you do with a drug that soldiers no longer need? The answer was simple. You find civilian markets, and amphetamines turned out to have an almost infinite range of applications: depression, fatigue, obesity, narcolepsy, poor concentration, low motivation. Anything that required more energy, more focus, more drive could theoretically be treated with a pill that made the brain buzz with artificial alertness. The marketing was relentless and remarkably successful. SmithKline and French, the company that held the patent on Benzedrine, promoted it for everything from hay fever to hangovers. Pharmaceutical advertisements showed trim housewives who had lost weight effortlessly, alert executives who powered through demanding schedules, students who aced their exams after all-night study sessions. The message was clear. Modern life was demanding. Modern medicine had the solution. Just take a pill and keep up with the pace. Doctors prescribed amphetamines with extraordinary liberality. A woman who mentioned feeling tired at her checkup might walk out with a prescription for Dexedrine. A man who complained of difficulty concentrating might be given Benzedrine to sharpen his focus. There were virtually no restrictions, no warnings about long-term use, no acknowledgement of the potential for dependence. The pills were handed out like candy to anyone who asked for them and many who did not. By the late 1950s, the pharmaceutical industry was producing billions of amphetamine tablets annually. The numbers are almost beyond comprehension. In 1962, American pharmaceutical companies manufactured approximately 8 billion amphetamine doses. That is billion with a B. In a country of 180 million people, that works out to roughly 43 doses for every man, woman, and child in America. Not all of these pills were consumed domestically, and not all were used for their intended purposes, but the scale of production tells you everything you need to know about how normalized amphetamine use had become. The housewife taking diet pills to stay slim and energetic. The long-haul trucker popping bennies to drive from Los Angeles to New York without stopping to sleep. The college student staying up all night before finals with the help of little white tablets. The salesman who needed an edge. The executive who needed stamina. The athlete who needed that extra burst of performance. They were all part of the same phenomenon, all customers of the same industry. All participants in a mass experiment with the human nervous system that no one had bothered to study systematically. The consequences were hiding in plain sight, visible to anyone who cared to look, ignored by almost everyone. Amphetamine psychosis was a recognized medical condition by the 1950s, a state of paranoid delusion and hallucination that could be virtually indistinguishable from schizophrenia. Regular users developed tolerance, needing more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect, climbing to doses that would have killed a novice. When they tried to stop, they crashed into depression so severe that suicide sometimes seemed like the only escape. The withdrawal was not physically dangerous like barbiturate or alcohol withdrawal, but it was psychologically devastating, a black hole of exhaustion and despair that could last for weeks. Highway statistics told part of the story that nobody wanted to hear. Truck drivers were dying in accidents at alarming rates, and investigation after investigation found amphetamines in their systems. The pills that kept them awake for impossible stretches also impaired their judgment, made them take risks they would never take sober, and eventually stopped working as tolerance built up, leaving them to fall asleep at the wheel after days without rest. But the trucking industry depended on impossible schedules, on delivery times that could only be met by drivers who never stopped, and so the pills kept flowing and the bodies kept piling up on America's highways. In suburban homes, a quieter crisis was unfolding. The housewife who started taking diet pills to lose a few pounds found that she also had more energy, more motivation, more ability to keep up with the endless demands of children and housework. She took the pills every day, then twice a day, then 3 times a day. She cleaned the house obsessively, reorganizing closets at 3 a.m, unable to sit still, unable to sleep. She became irritable, then paranoid, convinced that her neighbors were watching her, that her husband was unfaithful, that something terrible was about to happen. When she ran out of pills, she felt like death itself, too exhausted to get out of bed, too depressed to care about anything. So she got another prescription or bought them from a friend or found a doctor who would give her what she needed without asking too many questions. This was addiction, as real and destructive as any heroin habit, but it was not called addiction. It was called dependence or habituation or simply taking medicine as prescribed. The women suffering from it were not junkies, they were patients. The doctors who supplied them were not dealers, they were healers. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured the pills were not drug cartels, they were respectable corporations traded on the stock exchange. And so the epidemic continued, invisible because nobody wanted to see it, unaddressed because addressing it would have required acknowledging that respectable America had a drug problem far larger than anything happening in the ghettos or the hippie communes. The counterculture discovered speed in its own way, and the discovery nearly destroyed everything the movement had built. In the early days of Haight-Ashbury, the drugs of choice were marijuana and LSD, substances that the hippies believed expanded consciousness and promoted peace and love. Speed was different. It was the drug of the straight world, the drug of productivity and competition, the drug that made people work harder and faster in the service of the machine the hippies claimed to reject. But methamphetamine was cheap and available, and as the hate attracted more and more people in the summer of 1967, the dealers arrived with their own wares to sell. The transformation was rapid and terrifying. The gentle long hairs who had gathered to celebrate peace and love began changing into something else. Methamphetamine does not promote communion or insight. It promotes paranoia, aggression, grandiosity. Users who had been mellow on pot became twitchy and hostile on speed. They stopped sleeping, stopped eating, started seeing threats everywhere. The beautiful dream of the summer of love began curdling into something darker, more violent, more desperate. The old-timers of the hate, the original hippies who had created the community, watched in horror as their utopia was invaded and transformed. Dr. David Smith, who had founded the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic to provide medical care to the counterculture, saw the change firsthand. The clinic had originally treated bad acid trips and minor health complaints. Now it was dealing with speed freaks in full psychotic breakdown, with violence and overdoses and the wreckage of minds that had been pushed past all endurance. The hippies themselves recognized the threat. In 1967, a poet and community organizer named Chester Anderson began distributing a mimeographed pamphlet with a stark message. Speed kills. It was a warning from within the counterculture, an acknowledgement that not all drugs were equal, that some substances were incompatible with the values the movement claimed to hold. The poster became famous, reproduced and distributed throughout the Haight, a desperate attempt to save the community from the poison that was destroying it. But the warning came too late and was heeded by too few. The speed freaks kept coming, and the original hippies began drifting away, fleeing to rural communes or simply going home, unable to bear what their neighborhood had become. The Diggers, the anarchist collective that had provided free food and services to the community, staged a mock funeral for the death of the hippie in October 1967. It was partly street theatre and partly genuine mourning for something that had been lost. The pure idealism of the early counterculture had been poisoned, and amphetamine was one of the main toxins. The great irony of all this was the complete disparity in how different drugs and different users were treated by the law and by society. While young people were being arrested by the thousands for possessing marijuana, while the prisons filled with hippies and minorities caught with small amounts of pot, the amphetamine epidemic continued virtually unchecked. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured speed faced no criminal penalties. The doctors who prescribed it to millions of Americans faced no sanctions. The executives who profited from the addiction of housewives and truckers slept soundly in their suburban beds. Pillars of their communities, respected members of the establishment. Marijuana was a Schedule I controlled substance after 1970, classified as having high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. Getting caught with a small amount could mean years in prison. Amphetamines were Schedule II, acknowledged as dangerous but permitted for medical use, and the prescriptions kept flowing with only modest restrictions. The bodies kept piling up too, from car accidents and heart attacks and suicides during withdrawal and the 1,000 other ways that speed can kill. But these deaths did not provoke the same moral panic that marijuana did. These users were not criminals, they were patients. These dealers were not pushers, they were doctors. These manufacturers were not cartels, they were corporations. The double standard was absolute and unacknowledged. A black man caught with marijuana went to prison. A white housewife addicted to prescription amphetamines got sympathy and perhaps a referral to a different doctor. A hippie smoking pot was a dangerous deviant threatening the fabric of society. An executive popping bennies to work longer hours was a go-getter, an achiever, someone doing what it took to get ahead. The drug war was never about drugs, it was about class and race and control. It was about which chemicals were acceptable and which were forbidden, and those categories had nothing to do with pharmacology or danger or addiction potential. They had to do with who used the drugs and what they believed and whether they threatened the established order. The pharmaceutical industry understood this perfectly. They knew that their products were addictive and dangerous. They knew that people were dying, but they also knew that they had political protection, that the same legislators who thundered against marijuana and LSD, received campaign contributions from drug companies, and listened sympathetically to their lobbyists. They knew that as long as their products came with a prescription label and were dispensed by licensed pharmacists, they would be treated as medicine rather than as dope. And so they kept manufacturing, kept advertising, kept profiting from the vast appetite of Americans for chemical enhancement. This pattern would repeat itself again and again in the decades that followed. The opioid crisis of the 21st century is not a new phenomenon. It is the same phenomenon, the same dynamic of pharmaceutical companies pushing addictive substances, doctors prescribing them recklessly, regulators looking the other way, and the bodies piling up while everyone pretends not to see. The only difference is the particular chemical involved. The underlying reality remains unchanged. America has a drug problem, but it is not the drug problem we are told about. The real epidemic has always been in the medicine cabinet, not on the street corner. The real dealers have always worn white coats and carried prescription pads. The real cartels have always been publicly traded corporations with lobbying arms and political connections. And the real victims have always been ordinary people who trusted the system to protect them and discovered too late that the system was designed to profit from their destruction. By the end of the 1960s, the dream was dying. The Altamont concert in December 1969, where the Hells Angels killed a man in front of the stage while the Rolling Stones played, seemed to mark the end of an era. The Manson murders had linked the counterculture to horrific violence in the public imagination. Nixon was in the White House, and the crackdown was intensifying. The optimism of the summer of love had curdled into something darker, more cynical, more desperate. But the drugs did not go away. They just changed form, changed meaning, changed hands. The pharmaceutical industry kept innovating, kept finding new substances to sell, kept discovering new conditions to treat. The counterculture fragmented and transformed, some of its members becoming activists and some becoming addicts and some simply growing up and getting jobs and joining the system they had once rejected. And America kept taking its pills, kept filling its prescriptions, kept reaching for chemical solutions to the problems of being human. The 1960s drug explosion was not an anomaly. It was a preview, a first draft of a story that America is still writing today. The specific drugs change, the specific users change, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. The pharmaceutical industry profits from addiction. The government uses drug laws to control undesirable populations. Respectable drugs kill while forbidden drugs go to prison, and the medicine cabinet stays full, always full, overflowing with the promises that chemistry will make everything better. This is the inheritance of the 1960s, the lesson that decade taught us and that we have stubbornly refused to learn. The drugs were never the problem. We were the problem. And until we face that truth, the cycle will continue, generation after generation, pill after pill, body after body, forever. The dream died in stages, each death more painful than the last, each loss stripping away another layer of the innocence that had made the 1960s feel, however briefly, like a genuine revolution. Woodstock in August 1969 seemed to prove that a new world was possible, that 500,000 people could gather peacefully, share their drugs and their music and their bodies, and create something beautiful without the structures of authority the straight world insisted were necessary. But Woodstock was the high watermark, the last moment before the tide began to recede. 4 months later came Altamont. The Rolling Stones organized a free concert at a speedway in California, hiring the Hells Angels motorcycle gang to provide security in exchange for $500 worth of beer. It was a catastrophically stupid decision born of romantic notions about outlaw solidarity. The Angels, drunk and violent, beat audience members with pool cues. Marty Balin of Jefferson Airplane was knocked unconscious trying to stop them. And as the Stones played Under My Thumb, a young black man named Meredith Hunter approached the stage and was stabbed to death by an angel named Alan Passaro. The murder captured on film by documentary cameras that had come to record a celebration and instead recorded a killing. Altamont became the anti-Woodstock, proof to the skeptics that the counterculture was not a beautiful alternative, but a dangerous delusion. The media, which had grown increasingly hostile to the hippies as the decade progressed, seized on the violence as confirmation of everything they had been warning about. These were not flower children. They were drug-addled savages, one step away from chaos, kept in check only by the thin membrane of civilization they so loudly rejected. Then came Manson. Charles Manson was a failed musician and career criminal who had gathered around him a group of young followers, mostly women, in the canyons above Los Angeles. He fed them LSD and apocalyptic prophecies, convinced them that a race war was coming, and in August 1969, the same month as Woodstock, sent them out to commit murders that shocked the nation. The victims included Sharon Tate, the pregnant wife of director Roman Polanski, and 4 others who happened to be at her house that night. The killings were savage and ritualistic. The word pig written in blood on the walls, and when the Manson family was finally arrested and tried, the prosecution painted a picture of drug-induced madness, of young people so twisted by LSD and marijuana that they could commit atrocities without remorse. It did not matter that Manson was a psychopath who would have been dangerous with or without drugs. It did not matter that millions of people used the same substances without becoming killers. What mattered was the narrative, and the narrative was clear. Drugs led to Manson. The counterculture led to murder. The hippies were not harmless dreamers. They were a threat to every decent family in America. The deaths kept coming. Jimi Hendrix, the greatest guitarist of his generation, died in September 1970 from barbiturate overdose, choking on his own vomit in a London apartment. Janis Joplin, the raspy-voiced queen of psychedelic soul, died 2 weeks later from a heroin overdose in a Hollywood hotel. Jim Morrison of The Doors, the leather-clad poet of excess, was found dead in a Paris bathtub in July 1971, officially of heart failure, but almost certainly from drugs. These were the brightest stars of the counterculture, the artists who had given voice to its hopes and its hungers, and they were dying young, their bodies giving out under the strain of the chemicals they had consumed. Each death gave the establishment another weapon, another piece of evidence that the drug culture was not liberation, but destruction. The flower children had become cautionary tales, their beautiful music now a soundtrack to tragedy, their revolutionary dreams buried alongside their bodies. Richard Nixon understood opportunity when he saw it. He had ridden to power on promises of law and order, on the backlash against the chaos of the 1960s, on the fears of white suburbanites who watched the cities burn and the hippies dance and felt their world slipping away. Now he had the perfect vehicle for consolidating that power and crushing his enemies in one stroke. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, creating the framework that governs American drug policy to this day. The law established 5 schedules of controlled substances, ranked by their supposed potential for abuse and their accepted medical uses. Schedule I, the most restrictive category, was reserved for drugs deemed to have high abuse potential and no medical value. Heroin was Schedule Y, so was LSD. And so was marijuana, classified alongside the most dangerous substances known to medicine, despite centuries of documented therapeutic use, despite the fact that no one had ever died from a marijuana overdose, despite the absurdity of equating a plant that made people hungry and giggly with a synthetic nightmare that could stop the heart. The classification was not based on science. It was based on politics. Nixon needed marijuana to be as illegal as possible because marijuana was the drug of his enemies. John Ehrlichman, his domestic policy advisor, would later explain the strategy with brutal clarity. The Nixon campaign and the Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. They knew they could not make it illegal to be against the war or to be black. But by associating hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, they could disrupt those communities. They could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them on the evening news. Did they know they were lying about the drugs? Of course they did. This was not drug policy. This was political warfare disguised as public health. The Drug Enforcement Administration was created in 1973 to wage this war, consolidating federal enforcement powers under a single agency with vast resources and broad authority. The mandatory minimum sentences began, stripping judges of discretion and ensuring that even minor drug offences could result in years behind bars. The prison population began its long climb that would eventually make America the most incarcerated nation on earth. A machine was being built, a vast apparatus of surveillance and punishment designed not to protect public health but to control undesirable populations and crush political dissent. The counterculture did not survive the onslaught. By the mid-1970s, the hippie movement had fragmented and dispersed. Some of its members went underground, becoming fugitives from drug charges or radical politics. Some went back to school, became lawyers and doctors and executives, traded their beads for briefcases and their communes for condominiums. Some became casualties, the drug deaths and burnouts and broken minds that accumulated through years of excess. And some carried the flame forward in quieter ways, building alternative communities, practicing meditation and organic farming, keeping alive the vision of a different way of life, even as the mainstream culture turned hostile. But while the counterculture collapsed, the pharmaceutical industry sailed on untouched. Valium replaced Milltown as the tranquilizer of choice, becoming the most prescribed drug in America by the late 1970s. The benzodiazepines were supposedly safer than the barbiturates they replaced, though they too proved to be profoundly addictive, and the withdrawal from them could be even more prolonged and hellish. Mothers still reached for their little helpers. Doctors still prescribed chemical solutions to the problems of modern life. The medicine cabinet stayed full. Nothing had changed except the names on the bottles. The 1980s brought Prozac and the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, a new generation of antidepressants that the pharmaceutical industry marketed with unprecedented sophistication. They had learned from the 1960s. They understood that the key to selling psychoactive drugs was controlling the narrative, framing the substances as medicine rather than intoxicants, as treatment rather than escape. Depression was rebranded as a chemical imbalance, a simple deficiency of serotonin that could be corrected with a daily pill. Millions of prescriptions followed. The Prozac generation grew up believing that their moods were medical conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention, that sadness was a disease and happiness could be found at the pharmacy. The continuity was remarkable and almost entirely unacknowledged. The same companies that had hooked housewives on amphetamines and tranquilizers in the 1950s and 60s were now hooking a new generation on SSRIs and benzodiazepines. The same logic that had normalized pill popping before the counterculture existed continued to normalize it after the counterculture was crushed. The war on drugs raged against marijuana and cocaine and heroin, while the pharmaceutical industry distributed addiction by the billions with complete legal protection. And the bodies piled up on both sides, in the prisons that swallowed the illegal drug users and in the emergency rooms that received the legal ones. Now, in the 21st century, a strange synthesis is occurring. The hippie pharmacology that was criminalized and demonized is slowly being rehabilitated, absorbed back into the mainstream from which it was expelled. Meditation, once dismissed as hippie nonsense, is now prescribed by doctors and taught in corporate wellness programs. Yoga studios occupy suburban strip malls. Mindfulness is a billion-dollar industry. The counterculture's insights about consciousness and well-being have been stripped of their radical politics, repackaged as lifestyle products, and sold back to the descendants of the people who rejected them. The psychedelics are returning too. Research programs at Johns Hopkins and NYU and Imperial College London are studying psilocybin for depression and end-of-life anxiety. MDMA, the drug called ecstasy that was criminalized in the 1980s, is in clinical trials for post-traumatic stress disorder and showing remarkable results. Ketamine clinics are opening across the country, offering legal psychedelic therapy to those who can afford it. The same substances that sent people to prison for decades are now being hailed as breakthrough treatments for conditions that conventional medicine has failed to address. Silicon Valley, that temple of innovation and disruption, has discovered microdosing, the practice of taking tiny amounts of LSD or psilocybin to enhance creativity and focus. The tech executives who run the platforms that shape our lives are quietly tripping their way to greater productivity, finding competitive advantage in the same chemicals that destroyed the careers and freedom of so many who came before them. The hippie pharmacology has been recuperated, absorbed into the logic of capitalism that the hippies claim to reject. And marijuana, the drug that Nixon used to imprison a generation, is now legal for medical use in most states and for recreational use in nearly half the country. The dispensaries are sleek and professional, the products are tested and labeled, the industry is worth billions and growing. Former prosecutors and politicians who built their careers on drug war rhetoric now sit on the boards of cannabis companies, profiting from the legalization they once opposed. The reversal would be comic if it were not so tragic. Tragic because the prisoners remain imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands of people are still behind bars for marijuana offences, many of them serving sentences of decades for crimes that are now legal where they were committed. Their lives have been destroyed while the lawyers and investors who profit from legalization were never at risk, protected by their wealth and their whiteness and their connections. The war on drugs continues even as the drug war rationale collapses. The people who suffered are not being made whole. They are simply being forgotten. This is the inheritance of the 1960s drug explosion. Not a single story, but a tangle of stories of hope and exploitation, of liberation and imprisonment, of medicines that heal and medicines that kill, of laws designed for control rather than health. The pharmaceutical industry that created pill culture before the counterculture existed continues to profit from addiction in the 21st century. The opioid epidemic that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans is the direct descendant of the amphetamine epidemic of the 1960s. The same pattern of corporate greed and medical complicity and regulatory capture repeating itself with different chemicals. The CIA program that accidentally created the psychedelic movement remains officially acknowledged but functionally forgotten, its lessons unlearned, its crimes unpunished. The drug war that Nixon built to crush his political enemies continues to fill prisons with black and brown bodies while white users receive treatment and second chances. The 1960s drug explosion did not happen to America. It happened because of America, because of the pharmaceutical industry that normalized chemical consciousness alteration, because of the intelligence agencies that experimented with psychedelics in pursuit of mind control, because of a government that saw drugs not as a health issue, but as a weapon of political suppression. The counterculture was a reaction to forces already in motion, an attempt to reclaim chemistry from the corporations and the spooks and use it for liberation instead of control. That attempt failed, or rather it succeeded just enough to be absorbed and commodified and stripped of its radical potential. The drugs remain. They will always remain. Human beings have sought to alter their consciousness since before recorded history, and no law or war or propaganda campaign has ever succeeded in stopping them. The question was never whether we would use drugs. The question was always whose drugs, for whose purposes, at whose profit, and at whose expense. The 1960s posed that question with unprecedented clarity, and we have been living with the consequences of our failure to answer it honestly ever since. The medicine cabinet is still full, the pharmacies are still open, the prisons are still crowded, and the cycle continues, generation after generation, because we still refuse to see what was visible all along. The drugs were never the problem. The problem was us, the system we built, the choices we made, the lies we told ourselves about which chemicals were acceptable and which were forbidden and why. Until we face that truth, until we acknowledge the history that made us who we are, we will keep repeating it. The 1960s are not over. They are still happening. In every prescription written, in every arrest made, in every overdose death, in every prison sentence served. The dream died, but the nightmare it revealed persists, and the morning after has never ended. Return with me now to that medicine cabinet, the one we opened at the beginning of this journey, the mirrored door in a suburban bathroom in 1955. The bottles are still there, the barbiturates and the tranquilizers and the amphetamines, all neatly labelled, all legally prescribed, all waiting for the hand that will reach for them. A woman stands before that mirror, a housewife in a cotton dress, tired from another day of cooking and cleaning and caring for children who will never understand what she sacrificed for them. She opens the cabinet and takes out a small bottle, shakes a pill into her palm, swallows it with water from the tap. In an hour, she will feel better. In an hour, the edges of her life will soften, and the weight on her chest will lift, and she will be able to smile when her husband comes home from work. She does not think of herself as a drug user. She is simply taking her medicine. Now see her daughter, 15 years later, standing in a muddy field in upstate New York as the music washes over her and the sky wheels overhead. She has a small square of paper on her tongue, soaked with a chemical her mother has never heard of, and as it dissolves, she feels the boundaries of herself beginning to shimmer and expand. She will spend the next 8 hours in a state of consciousness that her mother's tranquilizers could never approach, seeing through the illusions that her parents' generation mistook for reality, touching something vast and ancient and true. She thinks of herself as a revolutionary, as a seeker, as someone who has broken free from the chemical cage that trapped her mother. She does not see that she is her mother's daughter in more ways than she knows. And now see her daughter, the granddaughter of that woman at the medicine cabinet, sitting in a therapist's office in 2025, receiving a prescription for an antidepressant that will adjust the serotonin levels in her brain. She has been told that her sadness is a chemical imbalance, that the medication will correct it, that there is nothing shameful about needing pharmaceutical help to feel normal. She will take the pill every morning with her coffee, and after a few weeks she will feel more stable, more functional, more able to cope with the demands of her life. She does not think of herself as a drug user either. She is simply taking her medicine. 3 generations, 3 women, 3 different drugs from 3 different eras, prescribed or consumed under 3 different sets of rules. And yet the pattern is the same. The reaching for chemistry when life becomes too much, the belief that the right substance can make everything bearable, the faith in molecules to solve problems that might have other solutions. The only thing that changed was permission. Which drugs were blessed by the authorities and which were damned, which users were patients and which were criminals, which substances came from pharmacies and which came from street corners. The question was never whether humans should alter their consciousness. That question was answered 10,000 years ago, the moment our ancestors discovered that fermented fruit could change how they felt, that certain mushrooms could open doors in the mind, that the world was full of plants and fungi and substances that could transport them beyond the ordinary. Every human culture in history has found ways to shift consciousness, to escape the prison of the everyday, to touch something larger than the self. This is not deviance. This is what we are. The question was always something else. Whose drugs, whose profits, whose prisons, who gets to decide which chemicals are medicine and which are crime? Who benefits when certain substances are legal and others forbidden? Who suffers when the laws are enforced selectively, when wealth and whiteness provide protection that poverty and color do not? The hippies were not wrong about the potential of psychedelics to heal and illuminate. The research that is finally being done confirms what they intuited half a century ago. The government was not wrong that some drugs are dangerous, that addiction destroys lives, that uncontrolled use of powerful substances can have devastating consequences. The pharmaceutical companies were not wrong that chemistry can relieve suffering, that the right medication can give people their lives back, that there are conditions that respond to nothing else. But all of them were wrong about control. The hippies thought they could escape the system through chemistry and ended up building a new system of their own. The government thought it could end drug use through criminalization and succeeded only in creating mass incarceration and a black market worth billions. The pharmaceutical companies thought they could manage addiction while profiting from it and created epidemic after epidemic, barbiturates and amphetamines and benzodiazepines and opioids, each generation of wonder drugs leaving a trail of bodies before the next one arrived. Drugs are not the story. Power is the story. The 1960s drug explosion did not create American drug culture. It revealed it, stripped away the pretense and the hypocrisy, and showed the nation what it had always been. A country that medicates first and asks questions later. A country that criminalizes what it fears and profits from what it controls. A country that has never been able to decide whether drugs are medicine or poison, sacrament or sin, and so has chosen to treat them as all of these things simultaneously, depending on who is using them and why. The sun set long ago on the summer of love, on Haight-Ashbury, on the dream that chemistry could build a new society. The bodies are buried, the communes dissolved, the music pressed onto records that grandchildren play with nostalgic wonder, but the pills are still in the medicine cabinet. The prescriptions are still being written, 3 billion of them every year in America alone. The prisons are still full of people whose only crime was choosing the wrong chemical for their pain. And the question that the 1960s posed remains unanswered, hanging in the air like smoke that will not clear. What kind of relationship do we want with our own minds? What do we owe to those who suffer and those who seek and those who simply want to feel something other than what they feel? What would a drug policy based on health rather than control, on compassion rather than punishment, on honesty rather than hypocrisy actually look like? Who are we, this species that has always altered its consciousness and always will, and what do we want to become? The story of the 1960s drug explosion is not over. It is still being written in every prescription filled and every arrest made, in every overdose, death, and every therapeutic breakthrough, in every person who takes a pill to feel normal and every person who goes to prison for doing exactly the same thing with a different substance. We are the authors of this story, whether we acknowledge it or not. Every choice we make about drugs, about policy, about who deserves treatment and who deserves punishment, adds another line to a narrative that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. The drugs were never the point. We were. This is not ancient history. This is the world you are living in. The only question is whether you are paying attention.